Now for part 2 of the Theresa Knorr story. Terry confided in her friend Heidi in Salt Lake City, telling her about all the atrocities she witnessed and experienced in her mother's home. The content was so disturbing and outrageous, it sounded like something that wouldn't even happen in reality. Indeed, after Terry told her, she sometimes wondered if she had imagined it all herself. Heidi wondered if it might have been the manufactured product of a troubled mind. Well, Terry was certainly troubled, but her sincerity was unquestionable. She cried as she unraveled the tale of terror that had so haunted her since she moved from California. She was plagued with nightmares of the events she observed. Terry also told her about the people she had reported the incidents to and how they did nothing, possibly out of disbelief. Heidi told her that her sister dated the son of a sheriff, him being Sheriff Clarence Montgomery of the Woods Cross Sheriff's Department. He presided over a community in which there hadn't been a murder in 30 years, so to be notified that his services were needed to crack a homicide case was surely to arouse his attention. Heidi called him up and said, "I got someone here you got to talk to, Sheriff. I need you to come over tonight." Montgomery said, "I'll be right over." By 11 that evening, Montgomery was interviewing Terry in Heidi's living room. He had never had a civilian relate such a story of abuse, torture, and murder such as that. It didn't help that because he wasn't accustomed to being up so late, he fell asleep a few times. The batteries in his tape recorder also didn't hold out toward the end of the latter part of the interview. Nevertheless, an investigation was being launched, and that was the important thing. Speaking of which, Montgomery wrote up a report of all the information he gleaned from his interview with Terry. A letter from Woods Cross Chief of Police Paul Howard was included with the report. The tapes of the interview were also placed in the package. It was all sent to the Sacramento Police Department's Homicide Division commander. The letter: "Dear Investigator, Theresa Knorr Groves of 2020 East Pepperwood Drive, Sandy, Utah, contacted one of our officers and related some information concerning a possible homicide that occurred in 1982 and a second homicide that occurred in 1985 or 1986 in your area. Theresa Groves, date of birth August 5th, 1970, stated that she was raised in the Sacramento area and lived with her mother, Theresa J. Knorr, possible date of birth March 14th, 1946. Her maiden name was Teresa Cross, but she had used the names of Boyington, Sanders, Harris, Knorr, and Cross. She has worked as a nurse. She lists the children as Howard, date of birth July 16th, 1963, Sheila, date of birth March 13th, 1965, Susan, date of birth September 27th, 1966, William, date of birth September 17th, 1967, Robert, date of birth December 31st, 1968, and herself. She says that her mother tortured and shot Susan and then disposed of her body in a car fire after several months. This occurred in 1982. Her mother also killed Sheila by physically abusing her, keeping her tied up in a closet, and after she died, the body was disposed of by a car fire near Truckee. Her mother had also shot her first husband, but had been acquitted of that homicide. These incidents occurred at 2410 Ivory Boulevard, apartment number A, but the apartment had been burned down to cover up the evidence of Sheila's death. Being fearful for her life, Teresa left the Sacramento area and has been in the Salt Lake City area since 1988. She has recently been arrested for intoxication and has used drugs in the past and is currently seeing an Alan Rice at the Valley Mental Health Center in Salt Lake. She told him about this information, and he advised her to give the same information to the police. She is currently living within the jurisdiction of the Sandy City, Utah Police Department and was only in our area to visit a friend at the time she contacted our officer. I have run the names NCIC with negative results on any of them. Our officer did record the majority of the conversation. However, without his realizing it, the batteries went dead, and the entire conversation was not recorded. I have enclosed the tape for your use. If we can be of any further assistance, please contact me. Sincerely, Paul Howard, Chief of Police. The package was received by Lieutenant Ken Walker. He assigned a detective to investigate the allegations. The detective was skeptical about the material in the report, declaring that they were unlikely to be true since he wasn't able to link any homicides in the area to what was described in the report. Terry's phone number was included in the report, but she was never contacted. The officials in Sacramento had investigated the murders and found that one was linked to the box case, and the body of the other victim had not been found. They assumed Terry's report was without merit, and no further action was taken. Terry decided that nothing would ever be done. Her mother would never face justice, and Terry would be tortured for the rest of her life by the flashbacks and nightmares. Meanwhile, Teresa was hired to work as a live-in caregiver for another elderly woman named Alice Sullivan. Strangely, the grocery store where Teresa shopped for the Sullivan home happened to employ Terry as a cashier. Teresa didn't seem to notice it was her, but Terry wasn't fooled by her mother's wigs. As Terry put it, I felt the presence of my mother nearby. I knew she was close. One night while watching television, Terry tuned into the program America's Most Wanted. She was inspired by the show to embark on another effort to bring her mother to justice. This time she would go directly to investigators in Truckee, California, where the murders were most closely linked. She was going to approach the staff most likely to take action. Police Sergeant Ron Perea of the Nevada County, California Sheriff's Office took a call from Theresa Knorr. There was something about her temperament that suggested she was sincere and not an EDP, or emotionally disturbed person. She told him her two sisters had been murdered years ago and that their bodies were dumped in the Nevada County area. She said one of her sisters was left in a box. She went on to tell him that her other sister was incinerated. He recalled hearing about a girl in Placer County whose corpse had been burned. October 28th, 1993. The next morning, Perea contacted Sergeant John Fitzgerald at the Tahoe City substation at the Placer County Sheriff's Office. He told him about the phone call he got from Terry and gave him her phone number. As it happened, Fitzgerald had worked on the case for years. He called the number, but there was no reply. He called later in the day, but there was still no answer. Finally, at 4:45 p.m. that day, a young woman answered. She identified as Theresa Knorr. She told him the entire sordid story of how she and her sisters endured endless torture at the hands of their mother and how her two sisters were killed by her. To challenge the authenticity of her account, the detective asked her questions about the jewelry her sister wore when she was burned. Terry answered every question with the correct response. After his interview with Terry, Fitzgerald said to her, "I am going to be working this case and nothing else till we solve it. I promise you." November 3rd, Fitzgerald ran a check on driver's licenses and discovered that Theresa Knorr was not only living in Salt Lake City, but just a few miles from Terry. November 4th, the investigators filed felony complaint number A27527 in the Placer County Court. Teresa and her living children deposited one of the corpses in that district, so it was decided that the task force for the investigation would be based there. Allegations included in the complaint were 2 violations of Section 187A of the California Penal Code, conspiracy to commit murder for victims Susan Marlene Knorr and Sheila Gay Sanders. Also contained within the complaint were a mention of special circumstances of multiple murders, and murder was especially heinous, pursuant to California Penal Code Sections 190.2A and 190.2A14. On November 16th, murder especially heinous was replaced with torture murder. While examining the house in which the murders took place, Fitzgerald recognized the closet Terry described to him, which appeared to be only 2 feet across. He called her and she confirmed that these were the dimensions of the closet. Fitzgerald was in disbelief that someone had actually lived inside of such a small space for so long. During an interview, Howard Sanders opened up about the tortures that Teresa inflicted on him and his siblings. In fact, he was so anxious to get all this info off his chest, he even admitted to committing incest with Terry and Robert. An arrest warrant was issued for Robert Knorr, since there was now corroboration that he had been involved in the murders. He was taken into custody at a Target distribution center where he worked. In the cruiser, he told the officers that his sisters simply disappeared and that he didn't know where his mother and brother were living at the moment. He did concede that the abuse allegations were factual. Amid the investigation, the detectives interviewed the father of Sheila. He told them Teresa never liked Sheila. He recalled that she beat Sheila on a regular basis. He remembered one occasion when Teresa was assaulting her with such brutality that he had to intervene. The Placer County Sheriff's Office issued a press release about the case. The press release. Sheriff Donald J. Nunez releases the following information. Sheriff Nunez announced today that a 1984 homicide one of the most alarming and bizarre in the history of Placer County, has been resolved. Theresa Knorr may be employed or seeking employment at a convalescent hospital. The press release worked. The media in Salt Lake City covered the story, and Terry even appeared on the local news. At one point, Terry said during the interview, "What kind of mother would do that? What kind of person am I going to be for the rest of my life because of this? All my life I've tried to put out of my mind what happened. I couldn't believe that it actually happened. I just want my sisters to know I had nothing to do with this, and I loved them. I don't have them now, and I want them back. I told all these people, but none of them wanted to believe I was actually telling the truth. They all thought I had Looney Tunes, and then I had problems. Well, what the heck do they expect? I have asked myself 100 times, why didn't I just tell them to run? I didn't know what to do. All my life I have tried to block it out of my mind." Now that the jig was up, Teresa got a loan from her employer and took to the road. She was pulled over by some state troopers for weaving haphazardly in and out of traffic. The state troopers got an eyeful of the stats on her driver's license. Teresa Jimmy Cross, 1296 North 400 East, Bountiful, Utah, 84010, weight 170 pounds, eyes blue, birth date March 14th, 1946, height 5 feet 05 inches. Teresa was released later that day because her name was not on the list of pseudonyms in the police wanted computer. For the most part, Teresa's employers were happy with her conduct and work. However, they did notice a couple of idiosyncrasies that they found peculiar. For one thing, whenever it was time for everybody to gather together for a group photograph, she was welcomed to join in, but she always managed to disappear from the room. The other thing was that she made a habit of leaving the room whenever Pat Thatcher's daughter Shannon was around. Shannon was young and very attractive, a woman in her 30s with 3 children. Such a woman was always a threat to Teresa. And this was one female who could not be locked up in a closet and incinerated next to some highway, given the circumstances. As Pat recalled, Shannon felt that Teresa did not like her from the moment they met. Whenever she visited Alice, Teresa would open the door to her and the kids and then go straight to her bedroom and never reappear until after they had gone. It was almost as if she did not want to share the spotlight with someone prettier and younger than her. Terrified of carrying on the legacy of child abuse in keeping with the standard established by her mother, Terry once was quoted as saying, "What kind of mother could do that? What kind of person am I going to be throughout my life? That's what I want to know. How am I going to deal with it? What's going to happen to me?" Police in the town where Teresa was now living contacted John Fitzgerald to let him know that a fairly recent driver's license application bore an address linked to Theresa Knorr. After conducting surveillance on the house, they saw no sign of her car. Hours later, they took another turn at monitoring the house. This time, the car was parked nearby. They summoned a local police officer, since Knorr was to be arrested out of state. John Fitzgerald knocked on the door. After a couple of minutes, Theresa Knorr answered. She had made some modifications to her appearance, like a 60-pound weight loss. Otherwise, she was recognizable from her driver's license. Fitzgerald said, "Are you Teresa Cross?" She stonewalled him. He said, "I am a police officer from the state of California, and I need to talk with you." She said, "Not in front of a lady. Come this way." The other two officers accompanied her as she led them to a part of the house where Alice Sullivan would not be able to eavesdrop on the conversation and be disturbed. Teresa led them to a bedroom. At one point, she said of the name Knorr, "I don't like that name." Fitzgerald said, "I have a warrant for your arrest on 2 counts of murder, and we are placing you under arrest." She came across as stunned. Then she told them she would have had to contact Alice Sullivan's son to notify him that she would be detained and therefore his mother would need a substitute caregiver. Fitzgerald allowed her to call Bud Sullivan. The conversation went, "Bud, it's Teresa here. Can you come down to your mother's house?" Bud suspected something was amiss. He said, "What's the matter?" "The police are here. They want to arrest me on a warrant." "What for?" "I don't know." Theresa Knorr was booked at a local police station. She refused to be interviewed without being represented by an attorney. She was soon transferred to a jail. On her way, she said, "I feel like a sacrificial lamb being led to the slaughter." She fought all efforts to extradite her back to California, which complicated things for the investigation. She was arraigned in Salt Lake City and was rendered ineligible for bail. In Placer County, California, William Knorr was brought before a fitness hearing where it was decided whether he would be tried as a juvenile or as an adult for his participation in the murders of his sisters. The fact that he was only 16 years old at the time they were killed was a complicating factor. On December 9th, Theresa Knorr filed a writ of habeas corpus. Still fighting extradition, she insisted she wasn't even in California at the time of her daughter's deaths. The Placer County investigators weren't about to throw in the towel just yet. As one commented, "Most of the evidence is pretty much intact. We've waited 10 years. We can wait a little longer." The governor of California, Pete Wilson, personally signed a document enabling John Fitzgerald to bring Theresa Knorr back home to face the music. He got similar authorization from the governor of Utah. Teresa Cross was devastated. She tried to convince a judge not to let her go back to California, claiming to be unable to fly due to an alleged sinus problem. It did not elicit any sympathy from the judge. She was sent back. Robert Knorr Sr. attended Teresa's first court appearance. Unable to contain himself, he stood up and shouted at her, "I hope you burn in hell for what you did to my kids, woman." Reportedly, Teresa shot him a look that suggested that she was still in charge, despite being cuffed and detained. Robert was also present to support his son William, who also faced charges. Apparently, William was very uncomfortable about being in the same room as his mother. In fact, his attorney even said, "My client is distraught about being in court with her." After all that time, Teresa could still invoke feelings of anxiety and dread in her children. Still, Robert's lawyer, Michael Brady, felt that Robert and Teresa should be tried together. As Brady put it, "If it is true that she was an overbearing mother, I want them tried together because she is responsible for the alleged homicide, not my client. Teresa placed some collect calls back to her friends in Salt Lake City. She apparently referred to her arrest and the charges as a, quote, Holocaust. She thanked her friends for standing by her in what she referred to as her, quote, darkest hours. November 15th, 1993. Theresa Knorr was charged with the following: 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 special circumstances charges, multiple murder and murder by torture. Initially, Knorr pleaded not guilty, but she went on to make a deal with prosecutors after she learned that Robert Jr. agreed to testify against her in exchange for a reduction in his own sentence. Teresa pleaded guilty in exchange for a rescinding of the death penalty as part of her sentencing. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. Theresa Knorr had a parole hearing in July 2019, but it was denied. Her next parole hearing will be in July 2025. This is an interview with Theresa Knorr's son, William.
This is a booking photo. This is me. Nobody expects to have one of these. I'm 25 years old here. 2 detectives took me into custody, and they said I was being arrested for murder. They take me into this room, and they start showing me pictures of these places. This could have been the entry or the turnoff where Susan was, or this could have been where my mom turned off for Sheila. The police came aware of the whole story through my sister, Terry. She had gotten herself in trouble with the law several times over the years, and each time she was arrested, she would tell this story. And they started asking me questions, mostly about where my mother was, when I last had contact with her. And that's when I start to get an idea of what I'm actually being charged in connection with.
After launching a nationwide search, investigators found Theresa Jimmy Knorr in Salt Lake City. She'd worked as a caretaker for an 86-year-old woman for over a year and had just borrowed $4,600 from the woman's son. Detectives think she was planning to flee.
I was glad that they found her and that she was caught, but that didn't mean I was free. I was brought into the same courtroom as she was.
Accused killer and son number 1 is Robert Knorr Jr. He's in a Nevada prison on unrelated charges, and we're told he won't talk with the cops. This is alleged co-conspirator and son number 2, 26-year-old William Knorr.
They believed I was complicit. If you weren't guilty of this, why didn't you come forward? You know, you've had 10 years to come forward. Why didn't you come forward? And the obvious, clear answer was, look at what happened to the people who did. Susan tried to come forward. She had gotten herself with Child Protective Services, and she's dead. So I just went about trying to live my life.
Knorr remained passive throughout the hearing, but her son, charged as an accomplice, was uncomfortable. His attorney says seeing his mother makes him nervous.
Nervous is not the right word. I was caught so off guard by her being walked into that courtroom. I just broke all the way down. I couldn't breathe. I was sweating. This, to me, is the face of my torturer. And the guy next to me told them to get me out of there. After that day in the courtroom, I have not seen her again. It's obviously a recent picture of my mother. The fact that she would spend the rest of her natural life incarcerated was a relief. I never saw any sign of remorse for my mother, ever. I don't believe she's even capable of remorse. And there will never be a time in my future that I will ever want to have contact or see my mother again.
Thank you for listening to Human Monsters. Bye for now.